Okay, English, yes. Didn't understood that it was me.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bariev Eskander. I hope you can hear me. If you can hear me, please press on the speak button so we can test your connection very soon. So if...
Good day.
Yes.
Good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon. How are you?
Good.
I cannot, I saw you just for the second and I could hear you, but if you can open your connection again, so please press on the speak button once so we can retest your connection.
Yes. It's
Yes,
okay.
now I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, but I cannot, I can see you, but I cannot hear you. If you can activate your microphone, please.
Так, I don't see.
Yes,
Do you hear me?
yes, I can hear you now. Yes.
Okay, it's good.
Yes, it's good. I can hear you and I can see you in Interactio. So everything is fine. Your sound is optimal for this meeting. Do you have any question about the platform? Do you know how
No,
to...
I haven't question.
Okay, perfect. And do you know
I
how
don't have
to find
question.
the interpretation channel?
Yeah, interpretation. Yes, but I'm Ukrainian.
Yes, yes. So please press on the Ukrainian channel and you can listen to
Okay.
Ukraine. Perfect. Thank you so much, sir. I wish you a
Thank you
nice
very
day.
much.
Thank you.
Добрий день, мене звати Анна Fotyga, я член Європейського парламенту і також член групи ECR.
The umbrella organization of Ukrainian human rights activists, MENA,
Активістів
with the permanent representation of Ukraine to the EU. We host this important seminar dedicated to Crimean Tatars and in particular their situation after the full-scale invasion of by Russia of Ukraine on February 24th of 2022. It is my honor and privilege to welcome His Excellency Ambassador of Ukraine, Всеволод Chantsev, to this event, as well as the EU representative for human rights, Mr. Emor Gilmore, as well as all distinguished guests, in particular active in and for Crimea. Without much ado, I would like to give the floor to our remote speaker, because this seminar is partly in person and partly remote, conducted because of important activities of our keynote speakers in Ukraine, in Kyiv and elsewhere. First, I would like to give the floor to First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Madame Emine Japarova. Is it possible to connect with Madame Minister now? Okay. That is, there is pre-recorded speech. She was not able to connect and to be delivered in just a moment. What about Rafat Chubarov? So I would like to give the floor to Mr. Rafat Chubarov, leader of the Majlis of Crimean Tatars, the legislative body, elected body that was so much persecuted by Vladimir Putin. And once more, proszę. Ja wiem, no ale słucham? Okay. So there is third try. We have some problems with connection to Rafat Chubarov, and now the Madame Tamila Tasheva, who is the permanent representative of the president of Ukraine to the autonomous Crimea. Madame, floor is yours.
Do you hear me? Hello, Your Excellencies. Доброго дня, шановні.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I will speak Ukrainian, so I would like to ask you to get your headphones, please.
Доброго дня. Чи
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Would it be possible for you to increase it?
increase it? I don't know. Do you hear me or not?
Чи ви...
Шановні колеги, доброго
Distinguished colleagues, good afternoon.
Un, deux, anglais, anglais, anglais.
You can start talking, Mrs. Tasheva.
Доброго дня, шановні
Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues. I hope that you can...
Доброго дня, колеги. Мене чутно чи ні? Дайте мені сигнал, будь ласка.
Please, Madam Tasheva, you can speak. It's proper volume.
Thank you.
Distinguished colleagues, good afternoon. It is a huge honor for me to speak before you today, and I hope that everything's okay with the connection. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be with you in person, but I would like to send you warmest greetings from the city of Kyiv, from the office of the Ukrainian platform. And what is very important to say is that this event is dedicated to the victims of deportation and genocide of the Crimean Tatar people, and in also to the new wave, to the most recent wave of persecution and genocidal practices against the Crimean Tatar people. In fact, we can see that after 2014, after the start of the invasion and the occupation of the Crimean Peninsula, and after the start of the large-scale invasion in our country, we can see that the persecution carried out by the occupation administration, how much of it there is against the indigenous people, against the Crimean Tatar people, and a number of political prisoners speak for themselves. We are talking about 181 political prisoners, and 117 of them are Crimean Tatar, including my great friend Mr. Mustafayev, and Mrs. Fotyga is his mentor, and we thank you very much for your support. Like my friend Jalalov, who was the deputy of the head of the Mejlis, who was apprehended after his participation in the Ukrainian platform. Rafat Chubarov and other speakers will mention about the persecution and the situation in the Crimean Peninsula that we come up against at the moment. And I wanted to just say a few words about what the Ukrainian state is doing for the protection of the Crimean Tatars, and not only for the deoccupation but also for the reintegration of the Crimean Peninsula. I already mentioned that Ukraine has recognized indigenous Crimean nations, ethnicities. It's the indigenous population of Crimea, and we are working on the status of the Crimean Tatar people, and we have been instructed by the president to make the first steps related to the reintegration of the Crimean Peninsula. What do we mean by that? It's the steps related to the reinstatement of public authority, public governance in the peninsula. It's working with the human resources in Crimea. We wanted to create a Team Crimea that will restore the peninsula, who will become the team who will work in the public authorities and the law enforcement, and of course to make this possible, it's very important to include the local population, including the indigenous Crimean Tatar people. And this is the second component. We work with the experts on communications. We work with other public authorities.
За колабораційну діяльність на території Криму і напрацювання засад амністії і люстрації. Ми розуміємо, що територія півострову 9 років була окупована, і відповідно ми розуміємо, що звісно, що життя на території Криму продовжувалось, і певна частина людей пішла працювати в окупаційній адміністрації. Тому наш головний підхід полягає в тому, що ті люди, які дійсно винні у вчиненні найтяжчих злочинів проти української держави, проти українських громадян, ті, хто займали управлінські посади в окупаційних адміністраціях, ті, хто зрадили присязі, працювали в правоохоронних органах або судових органах, вони, звісно, що понесуть відповідальність. Частина людей підпаде під засади люстрації на території півострова, решті людей немає чого переживати, тому ми дуже сподіваємося, що найближчим часом ми зможемо відновити контроль над територією Кримського півострову і що наші громадяни, звісно, що будуть підтримувати Україну у досягненні цих цілей, тому що ми завжди говоримо, що ми деокуповуємо не лише територію, а в першу чергу ми думаємо про наших людей. Звісно, що ми працюємо із рядом інших питань, які пов'язані з відновленням економічного добробуту Кримського півострову. Ключова робота, звісно, що буде одразу після звільнення
Crimea will look after Ukraine regains control of Crimea. Court registers, verification of documents will need to be done. So anything related to the routine life, day-to-day life of our citizens. And of course, we will need to bring Ukraine back to Crimea mentally. So we need to bring back the values professed by the
когнітивною деокупацією Кримського півострова. І звісно, що тут провідну роль однозначно грають кримські татари, інші корінні народи, права яких ми маємо відновити. Ми маємо відновити історичну справедливість до цього корінного народу.
I would like to genuinely thank the organizers and especially Mrs. Fotyga for organizing this event. And I thank the human rights colleagues very much. I'll stay with you until the end of this meeting, and I'm happy to answer any questions that this distinguished audience might have. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much indeed, Madame Tasheva. It's good news that you are able to stay connected with us. Actually, many persons already present in the room wanted to eventually engage in discussion. So welcome to Q&A session after introductions. Can we now listen to Madam Minister Emina Japarova? To kto teraz? Czabarowa nie łączycie też, tak? Okay. Now, I'm very sorry for this complicated beginning of our seminar. That's the fate of remote connections. I would like to give the floor to the EU representative for human rights, Mr. Eamon Gilmore.
Thank you very much, Member of the European Parliament, Fotyga. Thank you for the invitation to be here with you today. Ambassador Chensov, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon to you. It is indeed a privilege to join you here this afternoon. This conference is taking place exactly 15 long months today since Russia started inflicting horrors on the Ukrainian people through its full-scale war of aggression. For 8 years before that, Crimea has had its territory annexed and the Crimean Tatars their human rights denied. The European Union did not recognise at the time, does not recognise today, and will never recognise the illegal annexation of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by the Russian Federation. Today's struggle for all Ukrainians started in 2014 for the Crimean Tatars and is a struggle for human rights. War is the greatest enemy of human rights, and we remember that especially this year because this year is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as we recall the values contained in the Declaration, we also need to remember how it came about. How from the ashes and the destruction of World War II, humanity throughout the world said that this must never happen again. And in Europe, that in turn inspired the creation of the European Union itself. That declaration is perhaps nowhere more relevant today than it is in the whole of Ukraine, where the nightmare of invasion and the human suffering which gave rise to the Universal Declaration has re-emerged. It is in the defence of the values of the Universal Declaration, which the European Union and Ukraine share, that the European Union will continue to provide support to Ukraine in every possible way for as long as it takes. And only yesterday, during their monthly meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council, High Representative Joseph Borrell and the European Union foreign ministers exchanged once more on the military support being provided to Ukraine. Our commitment to ensuring full accountability will not waver either. In this context, we welcome the decision taken last week by the leaders at the fourth summit of the Council of Europe to set up a register of damage caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. The European Union joined that register and has already pledged initial funding for start-up costs. Also, we are actively involved in the discussions on the dedicated tribunal for the crime of aggression. The Crimean Tatars were the first victims of Russia's barbarism against Ukraine, having endured a ruthless campaign of persecution since 2014. As of February 2022, that machinery of persecution of the Crimean Tatars has further accelerated. The Russian playbook of repression for Crimea includes arbitrary arrests, torture, enforced disappearances of politicians, activists, journalists, human rights defenders, as well as residents of the peninsula overall. And the international organisations are being denied access. Today, my thoughts go especially to the many political prisoners and civilian detainees Russia has held in Crimea already before 2022. The stories of their relatives and lawyers and the accounts of the lucky ones who were set free remain our call to action as we maintain the same focus on the human rights in Crimea as we do on the situation in every other part of the territory of Ukraine temporarily occupied by Russia. Because human rights belong to the Crimean Tatars in the very same way as they belong to people everywhere else and in every circumstance, and we must all do our utmost to protect them. I have had the privilege of visiting the Crimean platform in Kyiv, and I have met on several occasions with representatives of Crimean Tatars, including former political prisoners. For me, today's event on the situation is an event on the situation of an indigenous people in a neighbouring country whose needs are tremendous today, but who will one day be part of our family of member states. And I look forward to the day when representatives of Crimean Tatars will sit in this building as members, Ukrainian members of the European Parliament, taking their place among the diverse families of the peoples of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Gilmore. Ambassador Chentsov, together with me, sits just in front of the European flag, and that is a good sign for the future, I think, and well represents our will to bring Ukraine as close to the EU as possible. We'll do our utmost. I think that now it is possible to listen to Amina Japarova, the first Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine. Actually, should we put on earphones as well?
This conference is a sign of recognition and tribute to Crimean Tatar people whose history is an example of struggle and resilience. Before February 24th, the world lived in illusion about Russia. The international community believed that everything can be solved at the negotiation table and continued business as usual with Russia even after it occupied Crimea and parts of Donbass. Crimean Tatars who suffered from centuries-long Russian repressions were not that naive. Detentions, tortures, kidnapping, arbitrary judgments, blackmail are the reality in which my people have been living for 9 years. Once prosperous and beautiful, Crimea has become an open-air prison. All those who opposed the occupation were labeled religious extremists and terrorists, although until 2014 there had been not a single act of terrorism in Ukraine. Russian missile strikes on Ukrainian cities came along with deterioration of repressions in the occupied Crimea. It worsened even further when Russia understood that finally it will inevitably lose Crimea. Last December, 25-year-old Leniya Umerova was apprehended by Russia at the Russian-Georgian border. She traveled from Kyiv to Crimea via a lengthy route through Bulgaria, Romania, Georgia and Russia to care for her father after discovering that he had been diagnosed with cancer. Today, Russia accuses her of being a spy solely because she wished to be with her family in a challenging time. This case serves as a reminder of the countless instances of unfair detentions, convictions, arrests and searches that the oppressive Russian administration in Crimea has imposed on members of the Crimean Tatars and their representative bodies. What today is taking place in Crimea is nothing but repetition of the history. These days we mark the 79th anniversary of the deportation of the Crimean Tatars ordered by the Stalin's Soviet regime and honoring the victims of the genocide of the Crimean Tatar people. The forced deportation of my people in 1944 took life of every second Crimean Tatar and was an act of genocide that put at risk the very existence of Crimean Tatar people. Soviet regime was transformed into Putin's regime, who greedily occupies Kremlin for over 20 years. This regime is torturing Crimean Tatars to death in prison, as happened to Crimean political prisoners Konstantin Shirin and Jamil Gafarov. It is forcing Crimean Tatars to go to war against their own compatriots. Criminal mobilization is used by Russia not only to prolong the suffering of people in Ukraine, but also to physically exterminate men, representatives of Crimean Tatar people. So-called women's streets, where children are brought up without fathers, became a new reality in Crimea. Today, Crimea and Crimean Tatar people need our support in their struggle. In 2020, we launched a project of public mentoring by internationally renowned persons. Each mentor acts as a public voice in support of one of the detained citizen journalists. It helps us to keep the spirit of our political prisoners high, not to allow them to be forgotten. And I'm glad that one of the mentors is Anna Fotyga. She is with us today. Sağ olunuz, saygılı Anna Hanım. We expect that more and more influential personalities will follow your example and will be involved as mentors in our initiative. To our international partners and the European Union particularly, fight for Ukraine's sovereignty.
Avoid responsibility and punishment. People like ideologists and followers of our communist USSR regime, which is guilty in many mass crimes in the 20th century against the people of the Soviet Union and the people in other countries. The most horrible crimes later recognized by the Ukrainian state as a genocide is the Holodomor of 1932-1933. It took lives of almost 4 million human lives, and Surhun, the deportation, as a way to eliminate Crimean Tatars by deporting them from their homeland and settling them in horrible conditions in their new settlements. By the end of the Russian-Ukrainian war, after the restoration of the territorial integrity of Ukraine in its international borders, the international community has to adopt a complex of political, legal, economical measures that would exclude an even hypothetical possibility of revenge from Russia. One of such measures should be bringing to liability and punishment of all Russian military and civil officials, propagandists that are disguising with their journalist activity, and other criminals as part of the Russian armed forces and Russian occupation administrations who are guilty in violence and murders on the territory of Ukraine. Another thing is the status of the liberated Crimea as part of the Ukrainian state. It is especially important as Ukraine is preparing to access the European Union that the family of free and liberal nations, the Ukrainian politicians and the Ukrainian society needs to understand the values of universal principles of democracy. Based on these principles, we have to develop our independent, democratic Ukraine. We have to develop an independent Ukrainian state where the indigenous people, and I have to remind you that all three indigenous people, the Crimean Tatars, Karayims, and Krimchaks, lived on the territory of Crimea, and we need them to receive a non-declarative but real political, legal, and economic guarantee for their development. That predicts a unified position of the Crimean Tatar people, and it consists in the fact that on the territory of the Crimean Peninsula, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol need to be transformed into a nationally territorial autonomy that will always remain an integral part of Ukraine, and that it will act under the authorities set by the Constitution of Ukraine. We are grateful to the deputies of the European Parliament who, in the resolution of the European Parliament dated 11 February 2021 on the association between Ukraine and the European Union, included a clause, I quote here, changes to constitutions recognizing national territorial autonomy of the Crimean Tatar people in Ukraine, which is born out of the right of the indigenous Crimean Tatar people for self-determination. We are convinced that Crimea will soon be liberated from the Russian occupiers, that the state sovereignty of Ukraine will be recovered on all its territory inside its internationally recognized borders. We are also convinced that the Russian-Ukrainian war will end radical reformation of the world construction of the international security, and this will protect a peaceful development of human civilization. Thank you for your attention. Glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, I met many diplomats, Ukrainian diplomats all over the world, yet I think that resolve and determination of Ambassador Vsevolod in bringing EU stay behind Ukraine resolutely and with such resolve is much credit to his activity. Ambassador, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Fotyga, and first of all, and good afternoon to everybody. First of all, I wanted to thank you for this consistent and steady of Ukraine, and it started not 15 months ago. It started much early, and in particular, keeping Crimean issue high on the agenda of the European Parliament, of European institution in Brussels in general. And you belong to this category of people who stick to their cause, whatever it takes, and we appreciate it. And it is not easy to be first, to tell the truth. When others is getting, you feel more confident. But to start, this is a real challenge. And I remember times when the idea of Crimean liberation, the idea of Crimean platform sounded crazy for many people. And it took a lot of courage to go ahead and to push. And as it was mentioned earlier, this occupation of Ukraine, it started with Crimea back in 2014. It triggered events in Donbass, and we hope that the liberation of Ukraine will also start with Crimea, or at least it will not too long to wait for the liberation. And many people in Crimea, outside Crimea, already feel this wind of liberation blowing. And Russian cowards and war criminals, they're scared. And it's good, because the most important is courage and will to win. And who has the will get means, and we are getting those means. We're getting weapons, ammunition, financial resources. And it's not just to protect Ukraine and to help our armed forces, which is definitely the first priority. It's happening because many of our partners really understood what is at stake. Because if you allow the aggressor to grab a part of the territory, and I remember very well those discussions, and I will not name and shame, but you remember yourself, keeping our hands, saying, don't do anything in 2014. If they move further, then we will do something. And it was a huge mistake. And we need to avoid this mistake now, accepting this logic. Okay, just maybe this territory or that territory. In history, there have been a lot of compromises. Why don't you consider? It's not just about territory. This is important to understand to those who enter into those difficult, dangerous waters. It's about principles, because what Russia is doing, Russia is looking for the reason, for justification of this war. And this war, and the same goes for Crimea in 2014, has no justification. You cannot bring any argument why Russia is entitled for 1 centimeter of Ukrainian territory. And we will stick to this principle. And this is how our leadership explain the situation and how Ukrainian people feel it. I wanted also to say a few words about anniversary of deportation of Crimean Tatars. This is the pattern of Russian behavior. 79 years ago, 1 year ago, it's oppression, war crimes, negligence to the human being, and we already suing Russia. Russia already has to appear in the court. We have an ongoing case in The Hague based on the Convention of Racial Discrimination and Elimination of Finance of Terrorism. And when we are talking about rights of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians in Crimea, we consider what Russia is doing as a violation of this convention and on racial discrimination, and we are talking about political, cultural, and other rights which are violated. And what is also important to remember, Mr. Chubarov, he's a chairman of Mejlis, which is banned now by the Russian Federation. And Russia is violating not the abstract law. Russia is violating now the decision of the International Court of Justice, which ordered Russia to stop this violation and allow Mejlis to function. So it's already for 5 years Russia is in breach with the decision of International Court of Justice. And it's one of the many decisions, I'm sure, which Russia will have to implement. And it's an example that international justice works. So we need to push further and to build coalition to bring Russia to responsibility and its leadership, and personally everybody who committed crimes in Ukraine, including Crimea, to justice. We have to make sure that Russia pays for all devastation and losses in Ukraine. It could take 2-3 generations, doesn't matter, but Russian people, they also need to understand that they're paying for being passive, for accepting the status quo, for what is happening in Russia, for accepting what the leadership is doing against Ukraine. We are talking about individual criminal responsibility, But Russians need to understand that this is also their responsibility, what their regime is doing, not only Ukraine, but to Ukrainians, but to other countries. This is how this world should function, and we will work and achieve justice. So once again, I wanted to thank all of you for participation in this event. Ukraine will win. We will win together. Slava Ukraini!
Героям слава!
Героям слава!
Ambassador Chensov. Ambassador Chensov, Excellency, thank you very much indeed for your remarks. Surely all of us believe Ukraine wins. Not only we believe, we think it is absolutely necessary and inevitable, and therefore we put all our efforts to enable this in our capacities. Before I hand over to moderator, Madame Tatiana Pechonczyk, I'd like to say at least two things. First, that we commemorate deportations of Crimean Tatars, but we have to remember that this kind of atrocities happened to Crimean Tatars in Tsarist era by Tsarist Russia, as well as during the Soviet Union by Stalin, and now by Russian Federation. It is well-known pattern. First, oppression, destabilization, oppression, aggression, invasion, ethnic cleansing, and then all over the world promoting the principle of self-determination. We clearly say territorial integrity of Ukraine, and hopefully Crimean Tatars, all prisoners, wherever they are able to return to their homes. And secondly, in the long history of Poland, there were instances when Crimean Tatars found their living in Poland. Kruszyniany are well known, and area of eastern Poland is well known, close to Białystok, but there is also a smaller community of Crimean Tatars in my constituency in Pomerania region, in Gdańsk in particular. That is also my home city. And maybe because of this, but obviously for many other reasons, I feel so much dedicated to fighting for their cause as well. Now I would like to hand over the moderation of next part of this conference to Mrs. Tatiana Pechonczyk, who is the leader of the Human Rights Center Mina here in Brussels, given to Ukrainian NGOs by the European Parliament. Madame, floor is yours.
Madam Fotyga, thank you very much for making this event happen and for all your efforts directed at the support of the Crimean Tatar political prisoners, but also for all the support that Poland is providing to Ukraine and this struggle that Ukraine and Poland are doing hand by hand to liberate Crimea and to protect the indigenous people of Crimea, Crimean Tatars. I'm honored to moderate this part of our discussion, and we will hear another distinguished panel. Historians, researchers, human rights defenders, journalists and relatives of political prisoners, which will give us their perspectives on the events which are happening and also on the historic implications of the repressions and the deportation from Soviet times to the modern and nowadays events. And hopefully we will have also two online speakers, one from Crimea and one from Kyiv. I hope that they will be able to connect and join us. Last week, Ukraine, with the rest of the world, marked the Day of the Remembrance of the victims of the genocide of Crimean Tatar people. As it was mentioned, this day, 79 years ago, Soviet authorities started ethnic cleansing of Crimea and genocide of Crimean Tatars. This crime of Joseph Stalin, Lavrentiy Beria, and other Soviet war criminals went unpunished and came back again. Today, Crimean Tatars are facing new waves of repressions and persecutions in Crimea, which started in 2014, starting from abductions and enforced disappearances, torture, politically motivated persecutions, court trials, and now accompanied by the wave of forced conscription and mobilization to the Russian army, when many young Crimean Tatar men chose to leave Crimea, not to be mobilized to Russian army. As my colleague Tamila Tasheva mentioned, out of 181 political prisoners from Crimea, 117 are of Crimean Tatar origin, including also our close friends and colleagues. So we might say that history teaches us if there is no justice, the crimes will come back again. And I would like to invite our first speaker, historian Gulnara Abdullaeva, to speak about historic implications and modern situation of Crimean Tatars. Gulnara is also working at the Crimean Tatar TV channel ATR. So Gulnara, please, the floor is yours.
Вітаю, дякую за запрошення.
Greetings and thank you very much for the support for Ukraine and Ukrainian peoples, including the Crimean Tatars. What is happening in the occupied Crimea today, unfortunately, has its own history that started in 1783 when Crimea was first occupied. And then its indigenous people, the Crimean Tatars, were under a real threat of extermination. And any resistance was accompanied by terror, massacres, and violence. In the first year, according to official data, more than 30,000 Crimean Tatars were killed, those who resisted the occupiers. Of course, it must have been a lot more than this number. The Crimean Tatars called the period of annexation the Black Age. They lost their state, their lands, their privileges, and their right to freedom. The occupiers began interfering in religious affairs, taking away their land and forcing them to leave the peninsula. This process became a real demographic catastrophe for the people. Those who remained were under a total supervision of Russian officials in Crimea until 1917. The October Revolution brought about global changes, and there had already been a galaxy of permanent Crimean Tatars that had emerged by then. But the victory fell to the Bolsheviks, who pursued a consistent policy of terror against the Crimean Tatar population of Crimea. On the 17th of April 1938, This day went down in history of the Crimean Tatar people as the Black Day. During 3 days in Simferopol, the NKVD executioners executed dozens of the brightest Crimean Tatars public figures. The real purpose of the execution was to destroy the authoritative representation of the Crimean Tatar intelligentsia, the politicians, teachers, writers, scientists, journalists, artists, etc. So those who were the opinion influences of the Crimean Tatars. As a result, Crimean Tatar historians attribute the consequences of this tragedy to the deportation of the Crimean Tatar people of 1944. And I'm grateful to people who speak up against the deportation. This is a terrible, tragic page in our history. Unfortunately, there won't be enough time to tell you about everything that happened. But after Crimea was deoccupied in 1944, in May, the whole of the Crimean Tatar population was deported. It was a moral and a physical destruction of the nation. At the time when the best sons of the Crimean Tatar people were dying, elderly people, women and children were accused of collaboration, and they were deported to Central Asia and to the Urals. 46.2% of the people died, and this was a real genocide of the Crimean Tatar people. In fact, from the very first years, the Crimean Tatars persistently demanded the restoration of their rights, and during this period, the national movement came about. The Crimean Tatars wanted to return to their homeland. In 1956, Crimean Tatars were removed from the register of special settlers and released from administrative supervision. However, this did not absolve them of the charges, of the accusations of collaboration, did not give them right to return to Crimea. An active struggle to restore their rights began. Crimean Tatar people needed a homeland. They needed an ethnic territory, a native language, material and spiritual culture. The national movement of the Crimean Tatars chose a non-violent way of struggle, and it basically broke the Soviet system. It achieved the return of the people to their homeland. And despite the fact that this was a difficult path, most Crimean Tatars began to return to Crimea from the places to which they were deported, and this was happening in the 1990s. And then on the 26th of June 1991, in Simferopol, the second Kurultai began its work, and the Kurultai elected the Crimean representative, the supreme representative body of the Crimean Tatar people, the Majlis. It was then that the Crimean Tatars self-determined to be a part of independent Ukraine. A little over 20 years later, and Ukrainian Crimea in 2014 suffered another terrible tragedy, a second Russian occupation. In fact, from the very first months, there was a wave of political persecution, searches and arrests, and mainly among the Crimean Tatars. The Majlis was declared to be an extremist organization, and a part of their representatives were forced to leave the peninsula, and those who remained in Crimea were jeopardized. And not only them, anyone who disagrees with the occupation of Crimea, who is sympathetic with Ukraine, who is religiously motivated, is subject to Russian repression. Criminal cases were falsified against these people. They fabricated against them. Abductions were used. Torture was used. And long prison sentences are meted out. My friend and colleague Nariman Jalal is currently held in detention. The Akhtemov brothers and many other people. The deputy head of Majlis stayed in Crimea since the start of the occupation. He was the voice of freedom. It was very clear from the very beginning that the occupying authorities will never forgive him his civic pro-Ukrainian position, but he never left Crimea, and he's been active in supporting all those who are now hostages of the Kremlin. After the Crimean platform in September 2022, another search came to his home. He was taken, and he was taken to an unknown location. Later, he was accused in the blowing up of a gas pipeline near Simferopol. He was accused of an act of terror. Of course, he and his colleagues have nothing to do with it, but the occupiers needed a high-profile case, but they didn't achieve what they wanted. He is being kept in detention facility number 2 in Simferopol. We hope very much that he and his colleagues will be exchanged for Russian captives. One day of Russian occupation is like a year lost from your life. Unfortunately, since the outbreak of the full-scale war on the 24th of February 2022, Crimea, the terror in Crimea has intensified. It's already spreading to new Russian occupied territories. As we can see, history is repeating itself, and if together with the whole world we do not stop Russia now, this mass terror will continue and will become much larger. My Crimean Tatar people hopes that very soon we will be able to meet in a free Crimea, and we will all say, glory to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Gulnara, for the work that you do to preserve and tell Crimean Tatar history, but also to fight for the release of Nariman Jalal and other political prisoners, and we hope that they will be released soon. And in the meanwhile, I would like to give a floor to our online speaker from Kyiv, Eskender Bariyev. He is a human rights defender, member of the Majlis of Crimean Tatar people, and Eskender represents the Crimean Tatar Resource Center. So please, Eskender, the floor is yours. You can share with us the information that was collected by your organization about the persecution of Crimean Tatars in Crimea. So please, the floor is yours.
Pani Tatiana.
Thank you, Tatiana. I would like to thank all of the nations of the European Union for the support for Ukraine in this very difficult time, when the whole of the Ukrainian people is fighting for its right to live, for its sovereignty, is fighting evil that is jeopardizing the whole of humanity. Crimean Tatars became the minority in their own homeland, and we are the subject to the policy of genocide, and we had in our history the forced deportation in 1944, and this policy has continued now since 2014, since Russia started occupying Crimea. They're replacing the population. They are being intimidated. Crimean Tatars being intimidated, and is being pushed out of Crimea as a non-loyal population. 600,000 Russians have been brought in from Russia to Crimea, and around 100,000 pro-Ukrainian citizens have had to leave Crimea. This is a direct violation of the 4th provision of the Geneva Convention. In 2014, we understood that either the whole world follows universally recognized civilized rules, or we follow the principle of might is right, which jeopardizes the whole of the human civilization. In 2022, what we saw as a grave violation of international law, we saw a large-scale aggression against the sovereign state, and we see a genocide of the Ukrainian population. We see war crimes committed in the territory of Ukraine. 100 of them as Crimean Tatars. 37 are on probation. 19 of them are Crimean Tatars. 32 are being investigated. 60 has died over the period of occupation. 27 are indigenous Crimean Tatars. And these trends, I wanted to identify these trends. We've identified 18. We don't have enough time to talk about all of them, so I will just tell you about the key trends that we saw in 2022. Apart from the violation of human rights that we continue to see since 2024, we have registered a number of war crimes committed by Russian military in the newly occupied territories. Also, a number of political prisoners, they're POWs, and there's a third category now, civil hostages who have been deprived of their freedom. Previously, activists in Crimea were warned by the Russian authorities, but we see that in 2022 to 2023, the Russian occupying authorities are using administrative punishments, fines, and arrests. The occupiers have created new instruments for the persecution of Ukrainian citizens. Over this period, the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation approved the decision to recognize the battalion of the Crimean Tatar battalion an extremist organization. And the Russian courts are now meting out sentences who are to people who are apprehended in the case against this battalion, which is a violation of the third provision of the Geneva Convention, who are to people who are apprehended in the case against this battalion, which is a violation of the third provision of the Geneva Convention. Also, they are persecuting people for quote-unquote discrediting the Russian armed forces, and they're meting out administrative punishments and criminal punishments. So they've introduced into the administrative code and into the criminal code these punishments. In 2022, they first used Article 20, Amendment 3 of the Administrative Code on propaganda or demonstration of the Nazi symbols or attributes. Since the start of the occupation, the occupiers have been using punitive psychiatric treatment against one of our colleagues who was kept in a psychiatric hospital for 5 years. Political prisoners are then sometimes deported to Russia. In 2022, there has been a partial mobilization carried out in Crimea, and the occupiers are currently looking for persons of Crimean Tatar origin who are avoiding mobilization for the Russian armed forces. In 2022, occupiers and the occupying media announced that they've uncovered cells, Hizbut Tahrir cells. Hizbut Tahrir really is an instrument to intimidate the Crimean Tatars and to persecute them. What can we do? What can we do right now, and what needs to be done? I wanted to give you a few recommendations. First of all, to bring pressure to bear on the Russian Federation and to improve the mechanism of monitoring of the implementation of the sanctions. To introduce a mechanism of personal sanctions regarding persons who are responsible for violation of human rights, similar to the Magnitsky Act. And we are consistently providing the list of these people. Secondly, to intensify human rights protection in Crimea. For example, prominent public figures could look out for particular individual prisoners. And I'd like to thank Mrs. Fotyga for being an example of a mentor of this kind. Next, to work with international lawyers in order to defend political prisoners who are detained in the Russian Federation. next to elaborate a plan of action to improve the situation of the indigenous people and to work with the Council of Europe and the OSCE to improve the response mechanism of the UN to the situation in Crimea, to ensure their presence in the courts when the Crimean Tatar cases are heard, to help Crimean Tatar representatives in third countries, those who are evading mobilization in the occupied Crimea. And seeing as this event is dedicated to the 79th anniversary of the deportation, can I just remind you that next year we will be marking the 80th anniversary. And we would like to recommend to the European countries to recognize the deportation of 1944 as an act of genocide and to condemn the persecution, the violence against Crimean Tatars by the Russian Federation and the occupied Crimea. I think this would be an important indicator that indeed Crimean Tatars have the whole of the civilized world on their side, and we condemn all of these crimes that were committed then, because if it wasn't condemned yesterday, and it's happening again today, and we're not only just fighting for our rights and for our freedom, we are on the front line of the fight against authoritarian regimes. We can see these egregious violations of human rights in Crimea. By combating this, we will not just defend the Crimean Tatars and Ukraine, but also Europe and the whole world. Thank you.
Iskander, for the work that your organization is doing to collect and document the facts of persecution and human rights abuses against Crimean Tatars. And we mentioned several times today the issue of political prisoners. Unfortunately, these numbers are growing all the time. And the last release when Crimean political prisoners were liberated was in 2019, together with Oleg Sentsov and a group of other political prisoners. But after that, no one was released, and the lists are only growing. And I'm glad that today the brother of the political prisoner Leniye Umerova is present with us, that he made his travel with us from Kyiv. It is Aziz Umerov, and I would like to give a floor to him, as we think, even given the fact that there are hundreds of political prisoners, it is very important to tell every single story and to fight for the release of every person. So please, Aziz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Salam alaikum. Вітаю всіх.
Salam alaikum. Greetings to everyone who is present here today. I greet you in the language of the Ukrainian Crimea. These two words, salam alaikum, means I wish you peace. And this is the peace that Ukraine is currently fighting for, being a shield for the whole of Europe against aggression, violence and lawlessness which Russia represents. My name is Aziz Umerov. I'm a citizen of Ukraine and a Crimean Tatar, a Ukrainian law enforcement officer. I'm the son of my brave father, who despite his illness and other difficulties remained living in his native land under occupation. I am the son of my courageous mother, who also continues to live in Crimea, waiting for her children who have chosen the path of struggle in the hope of returning Crimea to Ukraine, which is a guarantee of human rights in general and the rights of indigenous peoples in particular. I'm also an older brother, the older brother of Leniya Umerova, a 25-year-old girl who is now known throughout Ukraine. My sister was imprisoned by the Russians for no reason. They grabbed her when she was crossing the border between Georgia and Russia, heading to the occupied Yevpatoria to care for her father, who has cancer. Because of the Russians, her journey home turned into a denial of freedom and charges of espionage. Our President Volodymyr Zelensky knows and speaks about it. First, Deputy Foreign Minister Emine Jabbar tells the Crimean Platform participants about Leniya. And Jamala, our singer, remembered her in Liverpool at the European Eurovision Song Contest. The Kremlin is keeping Lenier in the FSB Lefortovo prison in complete information isolation. Can you please show the video? Can you please have a look? This is footage when my sister is being taken to prison by those who should be in prison right now. My sister used to work in social media, and I think many of you have assistants who manage your social media. And imagine that one day they will just be put behind bars for no reason. And I'm sure that in this situation you would make every effort to help. And I'm asking you to take Lenia's story and the hundreds of other similar stories of political prisoners, take it to heart, as if it was your child's teacher that was kidnapped, or your favorite blogger or journalist, or the person who makes your coffee every day. They are held in captivity simply because their views are inconvenient for the terrorist state. And I call on the European Union to respond decisively, because human rights are the foundation of a modern developed world and a key value of democracy. We in Ukraine right now are fighting for peace and the triumph of democracy, and we ask you to fight for our people. I call on the European Union to demand for the release of my sister and all illegally detained Ukrainian citizens, to create efficient mechanisms for the release of civilian prisoners held by Russia, create mechanisms to ensure that the leaders of the Russian Federation and all the war criminals are brought to justice, and to systematize the data of all persons involved in the illegal detention and ill treatment of civilians, and impose personal sanctions against them. I ask all of you to support political prisoners. I also appeal to the politicians, journalists, activists, human rights defenders, and civil society organizations. Please join us in covering the story of my sister and hundreds of other political prisoners and prisoners of war. I thank you for your attention and hope to see you in the free Ukrainian Crimea.
Thank you, Aziz, for your courageous work and for the work of many families of political prisoners, including those who reside in Crimea and who are fighting for the destinies of their lovely members of their families, and just to have a possibility to see them and to hug them. And as human rights defenders, for human rights defenders, for us it's clear that there are no effective mechanisms for the protection of human rights in Crimea. It is only the occupation and liberation of the Crimean Peninsula. But when we speak about all these crimes, persecutions, repressions, they are also now scaled up and they are implicating and repeating again at the newly occupied territories of Ukraine. Now we see another modern deportation from the newly occupied territories. And all these crimes started in Crimea, and it will be not possible without the huge informational campaign, which was fueling the hate speech and incitements to genocide. My colleague Irina Sidova, she is originally from Crimea, from Kerch. In 2014, she was forced to leave Crimea, and their Crimean human rights group now works in exile on the mainland Ukraine. But they have the network of domestic monitors in Crimea, and throughout all these years of occupation, they are able to document and collect human rights abuses in Crimea. I would like to give a floor to Irina so she can share with us their latest research and facts that they documented. Please.
Thank you for your attention. Since
the beginning of the full-scale invasion in February 2022, repressions in the occupied peninsula have intensified, and this is another threat, additional threat for the people who are staying, who are not loyal to the Russian Federation and the occupiers. Repressions are now directed against even those who were not affected during the occupation. These people are punished for being involved in any kind of civic activity, including Crimean Tatars, because they're the first ones to suffer from these repressions. Ahmed Suleimanov, who is a civil journalist, has a heart condition. He remained under home arrest. A case was falsified against him, and after the large-scale invasion, he has been thrown behind bars, and his health is deteriorating. Even by Russian laws, he shouldn't be behind bars in this condition. Another journalist was thrown behind bars. They are also persecuting journalists who talk about the violation of the human rights of Crimean people. Crimean Tatars are completely unprotected because there's no one who can talk about it. Irina Danilovich, a civil journalist, was simply kidnapped in broad daylight in the street, and a criminal case was falsified against because she was tortured and information was obtained under duress. She was sentenced to 7 years of prison simply for writing texts on the internet. And this is not just an isolated case. There are other 15 journalists and bloggers who were arrested exactly for their journalist activities. Maybe they were arrested for other violations, but in fact the violation is just that they were trying to speak about the truth. As my colleagues have already mentioned, almost 200 people are political prisoners, mainly Crimean Tatars, because they are not afraid to speak up publicly against the Russian occupation. All of these people are absolutely innocent. They simply were not liked by the occupiers because they have respect for their fellow citizens, like Mr. Jalal, because they're civil activists. And this situation requires attention from the international community because these people are subjected to torture, inhumane treatment in these places of detention. The conditions are horrifying. These people are being subjected to a pressure, terrible pressure, simply for being Crimean Tatars or Ukrainians. For the past year, the Russians have been kidnapping activists in the Kherson region, including Crimean Tatars, who they are accusing of belonging to the Crimean Tatar battalion. They've declared a terrorist organization, although this battalion did not take part in any hostilities at all. The only thing they did is declaring publicly that Crimea is Ukraine. So this is a 100% politically motivated case. Other people, volunteers, activists, are persecuted for exactly the same thing, for helping Ukrainians. There's even an EU citizen amongst them. There's a Spanish citizen volunteer, Maria Garcia Catayud. And our sources are telling us that he's currently held in CISO number 2 in Simferopol, although the occupation authorities are of the Crimea will not admit to it. We know that he was trying to help Ukrainians after the large-scale invasion. That's his only crime. Unfortunately, the Russian Federation feels impunity for committing all these crimes, and we must make every effort to bring to justice all the war criminals who are committing these crimes against the civilian population of Ukraine every day, who pursue a genocidal policy, trying to destroy us as a people. We must make every effort to bring each of them to justice for this unjust war against Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. Just another thing I wanted to say, all of these crimes against humanity would not have been possible without conscious preparation by the Russian citizens to this kind of behavior, because the Russian authorities are giving them permission to commit murder and genocide. We have seen this over the 8 years of the occupation. We have seen the stoking of hatred against the Crimean Tatars by the Russian media. And I wanted to tell you about the main methods and the main vocabulary of this hate speech. We conducted this research together with a professor from the Kyiv Mohila Academy. This hate speech is a crime now, because they are calling for openly, publicly, for genocide of Crimean Tatars, and we hear this from the mainstream Russian media. And these messages are spread by influential people who have large audiences, by influential Russian media who are spreading these messages to large numbers of people, and then this gives permission to the Russian soldiers to commit crimes in the lands that they've occupied. All of this evidence is being collected in order to then be handed over to the international criminal authorities and to national investigative authorities. This is the genocide, calls for genocide from Russian influential public figures that we hear every day. Unfortunately, they remain unpunished. And this is why I wanted to appeal to all of you. Help Ukraine in this war against the Russian Federation. Help us not only to defend ourselves, but to liberate ourselves. Because at the moment we will not be able to convince Russia to recognize its guilt. We need to maintain, not only to maintain help for Ukraine, but to increase it, so that this horrifying war would end as soon as possible, and all of the those who are responsible for war crimes would be called to account. The sanctions that have implemented against the Russian Federation for its aggression and lawful and unjust war of aggression against Ukraine, we must ensure that these sanctions are as efficient as possible, that all countries adhere to them and comply with them. Because unfortunately, journalists have been recording cases when sanctions are being circumvented by the shell companies. This includes shell companies registered in the European Union, and they continue to sell various spare parts, components to the Russian military-industrial complex, and they continue to build missiles and launch these missiles at the civilian population. Now in Kyiv, we sleep in the hallways in our homes because we are subjected to missile attacks every other day. That's very terrifying. And we hope that the European Union will increase its control over the implementation of sanctions and will punish those who will try to circumvent these sanctions. Only your support will allow us to survive in this war that looks like very much like a genocide of the Ukrainian people and the Crimean Tatar people.
For us, it's also very important to hear these people, human rights defenders, journalists who even despite all these harsh conditions, persecutions, pressure, continue to work in Crimea. There are some grassroots initiatives and groups like Crimean Solidarity that unites families of political prisoners and lawyers, like Crimean Process that monitors politically motivated court trials. There are also some number of independent small media that, despite all the circumstances, continue to work in Crimea. And I hope that we will be able to connect and listen to one of such journalists. It is Bekir Mahmoud. He is editor-in-chief of the Crimean Tatar newspaper Crimea. Бекір Ага, якщо ви нас чуєте, будь ласка, вам слово.
Дякую, шановні пані та панове. Конечно, я хотел бы обратиться...
Хвилиночку.
We cannot hear you.
Спробуйте ще раз.
Can we try again, please?
You have to unmute.
Вас, можливо, зам'ючений. Можливо, спробуйте мікрофон в себе від... Так, будь ласка. Не чути, ще раз спробуйте. Так.
Шановні пані та панове.
Чути.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Of course, I wanted to speak to you in my native tongue. But for now, I can only say the following words. On the 10th of February, in Novocherkassk detention center, 60-year-old Simferopol resident Jamil Gafarov passed away. 5 years ago, he was disabled because of kidney disease, and prior to that, he had a massive heart attack. And this was no deterrence when he was accused of crimes, unthinkable crimes, even from the political point of view. In fact, he was a very kind man who wouldn't hurt a fly, as we say. And on the 11th of January, completely confident of his absolute innocence, he calmly listened to his relatively short prison and sentence in comparison to the sentences of many other of his compatriots. So this is a moderate sentence, only 13 years. He was punished for simply talking and reasoning about the social order, and he was punished with full knowledge of his health condition, punished with the knowledge that the conditions of his imprisonment would lead to his death, and he was punished to the fullest, like he was a able-bodied serial killer. And this dramatic and egregious case is well known not only to human rights defenders and to journalists and politicians, but to everyone who follows events in Crimea. These are giant sentences. Sentences they came back from the Stalin era, albeit politically reprehensible in the eyes of the authorities. They were passed and imposed on dozens of Crimean Tatars, and together these sentences comprise 1,000 years. The shock with which the first sentences were received, the shock has now passed. And for several years now, they've been recorded and they've been retold. They don't arouse same emotions, only a practical response. And there are reasons for this. In Crimea, behavioral actions have been fraught with fines at best, and the minimum fine is the average monthly salary, and worst case, a prison sentence. It is slightly less than sentences for those who we would like to speak up for today. In this connection, I remind, if I may, that just for his appearance in the evening of September 4th, 2022, near the building of FSB in Simferopol, with absolutely harmless, sincere question, where are relatives and friends, Nariman Jalal, brothers Asan, Naziz Akhtemov, were taken away by the law enforcement officers the day before, without an explanation, an unknown direction. People were detained, and 60 protocols were initiated, and administrative cases on these protocols, despite their appeals, added 1.5 million rubles to the state budget. That's around $22,000 US. We had a comedy character who used to say, learn, take note and learn. But the situation is very far from comical. It is profoundly and enduringly tragic. The attempts to assert the rights, be it of a individual human being or a collective or national human rights, in all senses, are extremely costly and have grave moral and physical consequences. I expect that you know that our compatriots whose names I have mentioned got between 13 and 17 years of prison sentences, and they were never at the place where the crimes that they're accused of were committed. They don't even know what this place is. The damage to the gas pipeline was calculated, and it is around 100,000 rubles. And the people who went to the streets in the evening of the September 4th now paid 15 times that in fines. But no, it is necessary to punish the satisfied for their civil position and to mete out their and to ensure their silence. They got 45 years of imprisonment for 3 people. And recently, the beginning of May, after another 12-day detention for disobedience during a search in his own home, Abdurrashid Japarov was released. He's a well-known human rights activist, and a few days ago he received what we call letters of happiness or court summonses. These 2 summonses instruct him to turn up to 2 different court hearings. In one of them, he is accused of the abuse of freedom of speech, same as me 2 years ago, and in the other for creating fakes or defamation, which is purely ideological in their function. I'm not going to generalize from what I have said, but only because of the fact that they're fraught with consequences. There is absolutely nothing new or secret in these facts. But also, it is obvious that there's a sad predictability in all of these cases. Against the socio-political historical background of what happened in Crimea, and first of all concerning Crimean Tatars after May 1944, and in the context of how colossal was Moscow's influence in the peninsula, all of this time, regardless of the decisions of 1954, and seeing as it remained in the post-Soviet period, today's realities are hardly surprising. Most of the local ethno-conglomerate diaspora community, reinforced by the mass relocation of recent years, has not been and is not at all concerned by the core values outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or in the similar documents such as the European Convention on Human Rights. All of this, from the point of view of people who live here, is bad, harmful Western tricks. And the stricter the control of the freedom of speech, the better, and the more it is in the interest of this community. So, media diktat is seen as useful and expedient. It neutralizes the schemes of the enemy. It was in the 1990s, where some timid attempts were made at democratization in Russia. We witnessed here a fierce, rigidly pro-communist attack against any liberal views or sympathies. And the fact that Yeltsin was widely hated in Crimea for his anti-communism in the 1990s, this fact is well known. My point is that the current climate of repression and persecution has found fertile soil to the fact that few people are outraged by the lack of independent courts, the suppression of elementary rights, to the security of the person, freedom of speech, opinion expression, peaceful assembly, expression of will, and the list goes on. For 25 years, we have gathered by the tens of thousands in the central square of Simferopol on May 18th, the day of the mourning. And over this time, no one was so much as hit, or not a drop of blood was spilled. for 25 years, what has been happening since 2014, we all know. And if on this significant day for the whole people we're not able to get together and say a prayer together and to remember all the innocents who died in the deportation, what can be said about the other restrictions? The situation in Crimea, in the media, after the 24th of February has not seemingly changed. The internal pressure, the internal tension, if I were to speak about my newspaper, has gone up, but for the other media, they're in their natural element, because the media in Crimea are also very different, and there are some that are funded from the budget. They are pro-Russian authorities, and obviously whoever pays can dictate what is published. And our newspaper is the only newspaper that covers the persecutions, all of these horrible events, and we are the tribune for Nariman Jalal, for Server Mustafayev, Server Mustafayev, the Akhtemov brothers. We publish their letters coming from the prison, and other media do not do this. Hopefully, for now. Thank you.
For all your work and for the courage that you're staying in Crimea and continue your journalistic work, and especially I thank for drawing attention to the problem of lack of medical treatment and medical services to the political prisoners, which has led to the situation that in February this year, the first time in the history of occupation of Crimea, 2 political prisoners died in captivity. Jamil Ghafarov, whose surname was mentioned, but also Konstantin Shiring. And this situation is worrying because other political prisoners also lack of this medical aid. And you might know about the case of Irina Danilovich, citizen journalist from Feodosia, who went on hunger strike because of lack of adequate medical treatment. Therefore, we call all European countries to put attention and also to start urgent debates how to help our political prisoners who have serious illness, to people with disabilities, to elderly people who got very long terms, as they may not live to be released. Another issue that was mentioned is pressure and persecution to human rights defenders and lawyers in Crimea. And now, with growing list of political prisoners, there is no enough possibilities, capacities to provide legal aid. At the same time, Crimean lawyers are threatened, deprived of their licenses. They receive fines and administrative arrest. And if before the large-scale invasion, they were those who can speak loudly about the persecutions, now they are silenced too. So in this very grim situation, we also have a feeling, as those human rights defenders who work with Crimean topics, that it is also overshadowed by the gravity of crimes that are committed by the Russian army in the newly occupied territories. And we do all possible also to return Crimea to the agenda of the democratic world. And here I would like to pass the floor to Professor Andrew Wilson, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and he's working also at the University College London. So, Professor, you are famous with your research of Ukrainian history, but also modern Ukraine. At the very end, do you have some positive things, what might happen to Crimea soon, and what we might expect, what can happen with Russia?
Thank you. A pleasure to be here. Shalom Aleichem, Slava Ukraini. I was also asked to talk about how the rest of the world sees Crimea, but something positive at the end. is doable, yeah. Compared to 2014, there is more global solidarity with Ukraine, but it's not universal. If we look at 2 UN votes, for example, in 2014, the condemnation of the referendum in Crimea was passed by 100 votes to 11 against, with 58 abstentions. Whereas the vote in February, this February, on a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine was passed by a much bigger number, 141, with only 7 opposed and 32 abstentions. So better, but not universal support. Most of us in the West are part of the 141. So the problem is not sympathy or support for Ukraine, but there are problems, including a deeply problematical underlying failure to confront or even understand the mythology behind the idea of Russian Crimea, Ruski Krim, and call it what it is, which is imperial mythology. The 32, ironically, are mostly in the global south. Now, the think tank that was mentioned did some opinion polling throughout the world. It's on its website, ecfr.eu. And countries in the West, but also in the global south, were asked, do you see the war as Ukrainocentric, that the Ukraine supporters are defending Ukraine's territorial integrity and democracy? Or is the West defending its own dominance or own security, selfish reasons? And in the global south, if we can call Turkey that, only 23% saw the West as defending Ukraine's territorial integrity and democracy. 65% saw it as defending its own interests. Same in Crimea, in China, 23% against 65%. So it's deeply ironic that in the global south, Russia has some traction with its arguments or its propaganda that this is a war between Western imperialisms, or is even an act of Western imperialism acting against Russia. So to elucidate, this isn't just an imperial thing, it's a settler colonial thing that we have to understand. Not just a colonialism in Crimea, but the planting of outsiders on someone else's land, settlers. And 1783, the date of the original annexation, really wasn't that long ago. And it's not that long ago since 80%, more than 80% of the population in 1783 were Crimean Tatar. And the rest actually weren't Russians at all. Most of the rest were Greeks and Armenians. It's really not that long ago since the 1850s, Crimean War, when the Crimean Tatars were still the majority population. So the so-called golden age of Russian Crimea is both a relatively new thing and a relatively short thing if we date it from the 1850s to 1917. It's basically more or less the same length as Ukrainian Crimea administratively, from 1954 to 2014. Moreover, this inflow of population is an ongoing process, given how rooted this paradigm of settler colonialism is. The current population, for example, is 2.4 million. As some have said already, officially 53,000, but near 100,000 have been forced to leave. And probably about 500,000 have settled in Crimea from Russia since 2014. So settler colonialism is ongoing. But even more telling figure, if we go back to the summer of 1944, just after the deportations, the population of Crimea was 351,000. 351,000 out of 2.4 million today, meaning that the vast majority of the population of Crimea is post-war in migrants, mainly from Russia. And the ideology of Ruski Krim, or Russian Crimea, is loud and hyperbolic, because that's what settler colonial regimes always do. They can't tell a more relaxed or a different story, or a story of permanent settlement, because they're settlers. So they do what settler regimes always do, which is to denigrate, deny, and displace the indigenous population. So if you look at Russian historical mythology since 2014, a lot of which is recycled from the era after 1944, when they first had to justify deportation, or from the middle of the 19th century, when again Tsarist historians had to justify a new Russian presence in a foreign land, basically. Characteristic strategies are to retell hundreds of years of the history of the Crimean Khanate as just a kind of predatory raiding experience, not a real state, not a real civilization. To bookend, to squeeze those hundreds of years into irrelevance, to invent a myth of Russians being there before as well as being there after, from 1783 or even from the 1850s. To talk about reconquista, as in the Spanish term for, as they see it, reconquering Al-Andalus. The displacement of a foreign Islamic element. This is how Russian historiography presents it. So here, and this is my optimistic ending bit that you asked for, the Crimean platform is doing excellent work to combat this disinformation and to tell a true history, a proper reverse perspective to this tragically ironic idea that Russian has that this is somehow a Western imperial adventure against Russia. This is the reverse. It is a Russian imperial phenomenon in Crimea. And Crimean Tatars themselves, personally, like Tamila Tasheva, the presidential representative, but also Maria Tomak in the Crimean platform, are not only doing a great job in pushing back against that false view of history, but in themselves selling the Crimean story to that global south, right? Particularly to its Muslim parts. They're personally a bridge to this truer history of the peninsula. And they are also selling the idea that a Ukrainian Crimea, a return to Ukrainian Crimea, would also be a bridge because it will be culturally heterogeneous, a cultural crossroads, a link at the gate of Europe, linked to the new Silk Road from Central Asia, a new Mediterranean, a new Middle East, not, as in the Russian Crimea, an imperial outpost, not a settler population hostile to the indigenous people over whom they rule, and not just a military base threatening all of its neighbours. Russia's Syria operation would not have been possible without control of Crimea. So that is my optimistic pitch of the Crimea we can get back.
Thank you, Professor. Dear colleagues, we are almost at the end of our discussion, conversation, and we can continue it in a half an hour. We have another event linked to our seminar. This is a photo exhibition the stories from the occupied Crimea. These photos were done by 3 Ukrainian journalists, Alina Smutko, Taras Ibragimov, and Alena Savchuk. These were journalists who traveled to Crimea to film the realities, the life of the families of political prisoners, politically motivated court trials, the life of families whose children were abducted, and for their work in the occupied peninsula of Crimea, starting from 2014 to 2019, all these 3 journalists were banned by the Russian Federation to enter Crimea, and their travel bans were from 10 to 35 years. Of course, we think that they might return to Crimea earlier, when Crimea will be liberated. So in half an hour at 5:30, we will open the photo exhibition. It is located in the Ukrainian hub near the entrance to the European Parliament. So we warmly welcome you to join us and to go to see this photo exhibition, where we can continue also our conversation. And one more event will happen tomorrow at the permanent representation of Poland to the EU. And there will be a documentary film screening about Nariman Jelal, the first deputy of the Majlis of Crimean Tatar people, who is now imprisoned in Simferopol, in the so-called CISO, the pretrial detention center number 2. And this documentary, Nariman, the Voice of Crimea, is produced by my colleague Anna Fotyga. So we invite you tomorrow at 3 p.m. to the permanent representation of Poland to the EU to watch the film and also to talk to our guests. And we will hear, I hope we will hear his wife, Levisa Jelalova, who will join us online from Crimea. So now, colleagues, we invite you to the photo exhibition, which will be opened in half an hour. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for this participating in this seminar. Of course, I join Tatiana Pechonchik in inviting all of you to both events. Maybe toward the end of seminar, I would like to inform you that on Poland's request in the 11th package of sanctions, now in the course of adoption by the European Union, by the Council, there is always provision for sanctioning those who are perpetrators of atrocities against Crimean Tatars.
Thank you, colleagues, for your attention and for participation, and we invite you to join us and to continue.